please click to subscribe. I really appreciate all of your support. It is now day 86 since Nancy Guthrie disappeared, literally just vanished out of her home in Tucson, Arizona. Still no real explanation, still no suspects. It's been almost 3 months. In this episode, I'm getting into some new information. You guys remember before Nancy Guthrie disappeared, and I've reported on this before, there was this reality show that was set to tape and had already started taping with the Pima County Sheriff's Office. Well, now there are some emails that have come out through a public records request. Fox did.
The front door opens at 11:42 p.m. Not kicked in. Not broken. It opens, the way a door opens when someone answers it. Nancy Guthrie is 71 years old. Lives alone in one of the most security-conscious neighborhoods in Tucson, and by every account is not the kind of woman who opens her door to strangers after dark. And yet, the door opens. She steps back. Someone steps in. And Nancy Guthrie is never seen inside that house again. It has now been over 3 months. No arrest. No body. No confirmed motive. But here's what's quietly eating at investigators, and what nobody in the mainstream coverage has fully reckoned with. The people who were supposed to be leading this investigation may have been reassigned before Nancy ever disappeared. And the one piece of forensic evidence that could crack this case wide open? It sat in the wrong lab for 2 months while a sheriff posed for a reality television show. Stay with me. Tucson's Catalina foothills don't feel like the rest of Arizona. Up here, the desert softens. The saguaros stand wider apart. The houses sit behind stone walls and mature mesquite trees, and in the evenings the light comes down in long copper sheets across the Santa Catalina Mountains. It is the kind of neighborhood where people move when they are done with noise, where they expect, after a lifetime of work, to finally be left alone. Nancy Guthrie fit this place exactly. She was 71, sharp, social, the kind of woman her neighbors described as someone who remembered your birthday and disagreed with you directly and laughed at her own jokes before she finished telling them. She had routines. Morning coffee on the back patio. Weekly calls with her daughter. She knew her neighbors. She watched her block. People like Nancy Guthrie don't vanish. They're the ones who notice when something is off. Which is what makes the night of her disappearance so disorienting. Because on that night, something moved through the Catalina foothills that Nancy did not see coming. Something patient enough to wait. Confident enough to walk up to a front door. And careful enough that 3 months later, we still don't fully know what it was. Her daughter calls on a Tuesday morning. No answer. She calls again. Still nothing. By afternoon, she is driving to the house, and when she arrives the door is unlocked, and Nancy is simply gone. No signs of a forced struggle. No obvious ransacking. Just absence. The particular silence of a home that was occupied and then wasn't. But here's the detail that stops investigators cold when they review the doorbell footage. Nancy opens the door herself. There is no forced entry because none was needed. Which means whoever knocked on that door, whoever stood on that step at nearly midnight, was someone Nancy Guthrie either recognized, or was somehow convinced to trust. And in the days that follow, as detectives begin working outward through her social circle, her phone records, her calendar, they find no one who admits to being there. No one who can explain why she opened that door. The person on that footage remains unidentified to this day. And the expression on Nancy's face in that last visible moment is not fear. It's something closer to surprise. In the first 72 hours, the Pima County Sheriff's Office moves quickly. Press conferences, public appeals, a photograph of the suspect released from doorbell camera footage. The image is grainy, taken from a low angle, and shows a figure whose build and gait tell investigators almost nothing definitive. But they release it anyway, which means the FBI, who by this point has joined the investigation, believes public pressure is worth the risk of tipping off whoever this person is. Almost immediately, notes surface. Ransom notes, according to sources close to the investigation. The early indication is that someone took Nancy Guthrie not out of rage or impulse, but for money. A transaction. Which in some ways is the best possible news, because it means, at least in theory, that whoever has her wants her alive. But ransom cases run on a brutal clock. The FBI knows this better than anyone. You have a window, brief, fragile, during which the kidnapper believes they still have leverage. The moment that window closes, everything changes. And somewhere in those first critical weeks, something goes wrong. The proof of life demand comes. The family and the FBI hold the line. No payment without confirmation that Nancy is alive. Standard protocol. The right call. But the response that comes back is not what anyone hoped for. And then, the communications stop. The notes stop. The contact stops. And the case shifts from a kidnapping to something else entirely. While all of this is unfolding publicly, the press conferences, the FBI involvement, the ransom drama, something else is happening quietly inside the Pima County Sheriff's Office that almost nobody is covering. Let's talk about what an amateur kidnapping that goes catastrophically wrong actually looks like. Someone selects a target. Does surveillance, weeks, possibly months. They identify the pattern, the routine, the window. They approach with a cover story, something that explains the late knock on the door. Nancy opens it. They enter. They produce the notes. They make demands. And then the FBI says, proof of life first. The kidnappers have no contingency for this. They didn't plan for a professional negotiation. They planned for a frightened family to move money fast and quietly. Instead, they got federal agents with a protocol that doesn't bend. The clock starts running in the wrong direction. Panic sets in. And the thing they didn't plan for, keeping a person alive and controlled, for weeks, under mounting federal pressure, becomes impossible to manage. That's when the communications stop. The psychological profile here is not of a calculated predator. It's of someone who understood enough to plan but not enough to execute, who mistook the first phase of a kidnapping for the whole operation. And that profile, Moore suggests, almost certainly involves two people with a pre-existing relationship. Not hired hands. Not strangers. Friends. Or people who became friends over a shared idea that turned catastrophic. What it doesn't explain is the sheriff. Because while all of this is unfolding, while a family is waiting for news and federal agents are working a deteriorating kidnapping case, the Pima County Sheriff is coordinating with television producers, managing his media appearances, and making the specific decision to route forensic evidence away from the FBI lab that asked for it. Whether that reflects ego, institutional rivalry, or something more deliberate is a question this investigation will eventually have to answer. Nancy Guthrie is still missing. That sentence, 3 months in, should land differently than it did on day one. Because now we know it isn't just the kidnappers who failed her. There is a compounding failure here, of institutional leadership, of interagency cooperation, of basic investigative prioritization, that has quietly extended the window in which Nancy might have been found. The FBI has the hair now. Testing is underway. The doorbell footage exists. The surveillance vehicle sightings are in the database somewhere. The notes are in evidence. The case is not cold. But it is slower than it should be, and the reasons for that slowness have names and press conference schedules. Cases like this one have changed things before. The ransom note protocol exists because of past failures. Interagency frameworks were built in blood after earlier cases where turf wars cost lives. The question Nancy Guthrie's disappearance is already forcing is whether an elected sheriff, one with a television deal and a history of moving experienced investigators out of leadership for political reasons, should have operational control over a federal kidnapping investigation. That question is not rhetorical. It is going to be answered by whatever comes next. The sheriff chose a private lab over the FBI. That decision cost this investigation 2 months on its most promising piece of forensic evidence. I want to know what you think, and I want you to be specific about it. Was that a calculated decision to keep the FBI at arm's length for reasons we don't yet understand? Or was it simple institutional ego from an elected official who confused media presence with investigative competence? Because those two answers lead to very different places. Drop it in the comments. I read every one. And I'll be back the moment anything breaks. Emails obtained through a public records request reveal that in the months before Nancy Guthrie disappeared, the sheriff's office was deep in negotiations with A&E for a reality television series. Producers were requesting ride-alongs, body camera footage, and sit-down interviews with department leadership. And when A&E inquired about scheduling the heads of the homicide unit and the cold case unit, the response they received used a very specific phrase. The experienced leaders of both units, homicide and cold cases, had been moved out of their positions. According to multiple sources, this wasn't standard rotation. These were people who hadn't supported the sheriff in his election. They were replaced. And when Nancy Guthrie disappeared, The people who would normally have led this investigation were already gone. Retired FBI Special Agent Steve Moore has worked kidnapping cases across 3 decades. When asked directly whether experienced leadership in those roles could have changed the trajectory of the Guthrie investigation, his answer is careful but unambiguous. I can't say for sure it would have been solved. But we would have been way farther down the road, and possibly solved. That word, possibly, is doing a lot of work. Because the investigation is not proceeding cleanly. Evidence timelines are murky. Interagency communication is strained. And then comes the moment that crystallizes exactly how strained things have become. A hair. Recovered at the scene early in the investigation, processed at a private lab in Florida, a lab the sheriff's office contracts with regularly. Routine on its face. Except the FBI had asked, 2 months prior, to test that same hair themselves. Using their own lab. The same technology. And the sheriff's office said no. When the hair is finally sent to the FBI lab, the Bureau issues a public statement. This is extraordinarily rare. Federal agencies almost never publicly call out local partners. The statement reads, in part, FBI asked to test this DNA 2 months ago with the same technology we've always had when the local sheriff instead sent it to a private lab. They don't use the sheriff's name. That omission is not accidental. Here's what that statement tells you if you know how to read it. The FBI is not just frustrated. They are, through the most carefully controlled institutional language possible, telling the public that evidence management in this case was compromised by a decision made at the top, not by investigators, not by forensic technicians, but by an elected official who may have been more focused on his public profile than on finding a 71-year-old woman. And that hair, the one that sat in a Florida lab for 2 months while the FBI waited, may yet tell us something. Or it may tell us nothing. But we will never know what 2 months of additional FBI analysis might have produced. That time is gone. The question of how many people were involved in Nancy's disappearance has quietly divided investigators and analysts following the case. The doorbell footage shows one figure, one set of movements, one person at the door. But kidnapping cases, particularly those involving an adult victim removed from a secured private residence, almost never work with a single operative. Steve Moore frames it in terms of simple logistics. You can't live your normal life if you have a guest in your house who's trying to escape. It's undoable with one person for any length of time. The statistical weight sits with 2 perpetrators. But the physical evidence, at least what's been made public, shows only one. Which leaves 2 possibilities. Either this was a lone actor of unusual capability and nerve. Or, whoever helped him has not appeared on a single camera, left no recoverable trace, and has remained completely silent for over 3 months. That kind of silence, Moore notes, rarely holds. Everybody has a risk tolerance. One of the 2 will bail before the other one does. It's like playing chicken. The implication being that if there are 2, we may be one breaking point away from this case cracking open entirely. Meanwhile, a volunteer search organization called Kinja Navy submits a formal proposal to the sheriff's office. They want to bring drones, dogs, and trained personnel. They ask only for guidance on where to search. They're not trying to freelance. They're offering to operate under the department's direction. The proposal is submitted. A revised proposal is submitted. The sheriff's office does not respond. The Sonoran Desert surrounding Tucson covers thousands of square miles of terrain that has not been systematically searched. Flash washes cut through bajadas where a car could access open land at night without using a paved road. The desert does not give up what it takes quickly. But it does, eventually, give it up. And nobody is looking. There is one theory circulating among investigators and analysts that has received almost no mainstream attention, and it reframes everything about this case. What if the ransom was never the point? What if the notes, the communications, the kidnapping framework, all of it, was constructed to obscure a motive that has nothing to do with money? Steve Moore doesn't believe it. His read is that this was an amateur operation that collapsed when the kidnappers lost their leverage. But he acknowledges the theory cannot be ruled out. And if it's true, then everyone, the FBI, the sheriff's office, the family, the public, has been chasing the wrong story for 3 months. The real motive would still be out there, untouched.